Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and get started. So thank you everybody who's here in person and on Zoom, hopefully. So my name is Sana Massoud, and I'm the head of the Medical Center Archives here at New York Presbyterian Weill Cornell. So I want to thank all of you for joining us today and in person and online for today's lecture with Dr. Carolyn Eastman. We welcome participation from all attendees during the question and answer session following the lecture. For attendees online, there is a Q&A box on the bottom of your screen where you can enter a question. We will get to as many questions as possible after the lecture. Closed captioning is also available, and you can find the option at the bottom of your screen to turn it on or off. The Heberden Society is a history of medicine lecture series that has been held at Weill Cornell Medical Center since 1975. I would like to thank the Office of the Dean for continuing to support the series. Today's lecture marks the end of the 2024-2025 season, so please be on the lookout for information about 2025-2026's season coming soon. All Heberden lectures are hybrid, free, and open to the public, so we are always happy to have you all join us. If you're interested in the history of New York Presbyterian Weill Cornell Medical Center, I invite you to visit the Medical Center Archives. The archives includes materials dating back to 1771, including this photo of hospital staff seeing off a patient who's leaving in his taxi, and while a cameraman is filming a TV spot, presumably about the hospital. And this was taken in the summer of 1970. So you can find more than 14,000 digitized photographs and documents online through our website, and the link is seen here. We have even more material available for research in person, and I am happy to help with planning any research visits. You can contact the archives also at the email noted on this slide here. I would also next like to thank Anna Vaith and Nathan Ash, who have partnered with the History of Medicine Club with Heberden today to provide refreshments for those of us who are here on site in person. And Anna and Nathan are also two of our medical student representatives for the Heberden Society. And so with that, I'd like to invite Nathan up to talk a little bit about History of Medicine Club and also introduce Dr. Eastman. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Nathan Ash. I am a third-year medical student, and with Anna, I'm running the newly formed History of Medicine Club here at Cornell. I think we'd like to thank MSEC, who will be funding the food today. So that is our student kind of club oversight body. So it's my pleasure today to welcome Professor Carolyn Eastman to speak with us tonight. Dr. Eastman is professor of history at Virginia Commonwealth University. Her research focuses on the uses and meanings of 18th and 19th century American media, paying special attention to non-elite readers, listeners, and viewers. Her most recent book, The Strange Genius of Mr. O, the United States' First Forgotten Celebrity, which won the James Bradford Best Biography Prize in the Library of Virginia Literary Award in Nonfiction, uses the life of, is it James Ogilvy? Am I pronouncing that right? Okay, James Ogilvy, as a window into early American political and celebrity culture. Her current book project, A Plague in New York City, How the City Confronted and Survived the Yellow Fever Epidemics of the Founding Era, examines the history of frontline workers and the mixed-race hospital staffs they formed to care for the ill during the yellow fever epidemic of the 1790s, a period of great change and uncertainty in New York City. Professor Eastman was also the first recipient of the David J. Wolfe, MD Visiting Research Scholar Program, which supported her travel to visit New York Presbyterian Weill Cornell Medical Center archives and to use the collections for her research. So please join me in welcoming Professor Eastman. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming, and I especially want to thank quickly Nicole Milano, who is no longer working at the archives, but who set this whole thing up, Sana Massoud, who made all the arrangements, and I especially want to thank the staff of the medical archives, Amanda Garfunkel and Tali Hahn, both of whom need a raise as far as I'm concerned, and to Dr. David Wolfe, who is the person who funded the research grant that allowed me to come for a full week and do research in the archive. Thank you all for coming at this busy time. Okay, so first I need to get my PowerPoint. So bear with me for just one moment. Okay. I want to take you back to a moment in time when a mysterious fever rampaged through New York City. Residents talked about being besieged by illness everywhere. Thousands fled the city for the countryside, so many that those who delayed found it impossible to get transportation. Hospitals were overrun, and nurses and doctors were often the first to get sick. People who ventured out into the streets held up a handkerchief to their nose and mouth, fearful of what they might breathe in. Meanwhile, wild claims about miracle drugs, restrictive diets, and other health regimens tricked some into believing that they could outwit the disease. They could not. I'm talking, of course, about yellow fever, a terrible disease that threatened urban centers like Philadelphia and New York every late summer starting in the 1790s. Nobody knew where it had come from or how it spread. Yellow fever was one of the most terrifying diseases of the age, made worse by the dramatic and horrifying symptoms that sickened people quickly and often fatally. It was distinguished by jaundice, the liver damage that turned one's eyes and skin yellow. High fever also came with the infection. In many cases, you might have a mild version of the disease. So after fighting a fever with muscle aches and headache for a few days, the disease subsided and you began to recover. The worst cases, though, were the scariest. Some who thought they'd begun to recover now got a second round of fever so high that they began to hemorrhage internally. Their bodies simply couldn't reabsorb the blood, which sometimes leaked from their eyes or ears. It took more than a century for researchers to discover that a particular species of mosquito spread the virus from the sick to the healthy, and not until 1938 did they come up with a vaccine that we still strongly advise for people traveling to areas where the virus is endemic. But if you're tempted to think that yellow fever is a problem that's been solved, it's worth knowing that doctors still have no cure, especially for those who succumb to the most serious phase of the disease. The yellow fever epidemics that cycled through American cities during the founding era were gruesome and profoundly deadly. During Philadelphia's famously devastating epidemic in 1793, between 10 and 12% of the population died. Another 6% died again in a subsequent outbreak 5 years later. In New York in 1798, about 3.5% to 4% of the population died. The terrors associated with the disease prompted an enormous outpouring of scientific research at the time in the form of books, articles, and newspaper stories, such that the historians who've studied that era tend to focus on those writings by doctors and other medical experts. So that scholarship on the history of medicine has been terrifically rich and nuanced, but it can keep the spotlight on the doctors rather than on the rest of the population. I have illustrated here a fanciful sketch drawn by a young Columbia medical student at the time. And I think when you look at it, you'll likely agree that the people we notice first are the figure of death and the heroic doctor who fights him off with a musket. As you do, right? It's been more rare, though, for scholars to analyze the experiences of other frontline workers, both Black and white, such as the nurse who stands beside the sick patient in bed. In the wake of COVID-19, you won't be surprised to learn that focusing on the public health side of the story and the experiences of those frontline workers has become a major concern of mine. I'm also very aware that this spring is the 5th anniversary of what COVID wrought in this city. And I have to say that before COVID, I had no intention of studying the topic of yellow fever. I was actually beginning to work on an entirely different project when March and April of 2020 came along. And I spent all of my time doom scrolling the news about New York, feeling alternately enraged and moved to tears by the accounts of New Yorkers applauding frontline workers from their apartment windows or singing together apart. It was while I was in this sort of neurotic state that I turned my attention to the story of yellow fever in New York during the 1790s, which is, I have to say, a topic that has barely been touched. In fact, it was the diary of this same young medical student who drew the sketch, Alexander Anderson, that drew me into the subject. Anderson had been only 20 when the first epidemic hit New York City in 1795. And 3 years later, in the midst of a significantly more deadly epidemic, he lost everyone in his family. First, his 4-month-old baby, then his wife, his brother, his mother, his father, his in-laws, and what he described as almost all my friends. Next to each of the entries recording these deaths, Anderson sketched a coffin in the margins, visual markers of the unrelenting losses he suffered. And in fact, when I first read the diary at Butler Library about 20 years ago, I was so affected by these entries that I had to leave the building for a while. But tonight, what I want to do is introduce you to some of the people usually left out of the story, often because they left no records behind. And yet these people, Black and white New Yorkers, many of whom were immigrants or who had migrated to the city in recent years, put their lives at risk when they took on work designed to help the sick or bury the dead. And I'm going to proceed in two parts. So in the first half of the talk, actually more than the first half, I'm going to attempt to reconstruct and describe their experiences that, however anecdotal, reveal what it was like to live through the crises. And in the second half, I'll pull back to think about what these people can tell us about the larger effects of yellow fever epidemics in New York. So New York had two really bad epidemics. These were not the only ones, but these were bad in 1795 and 98. And it was partly because those were especially wet summers. In August of 1798, for example, the city was hit by a deluge. It rained not in large drops like a thunder shower, as one resident recalled, but in floating sheets of transparent water. It poured down a blacksmith's chimney and it extinguished his fire. In Maiden Lane, from Gold to Pearl Streets, the water was 3 feet deep. All the cellars in William Street to the East River were filled with water, he remembered. At first, residents believed that the rain might actually do good by cleansing the streets of garbage and animal waste that accumulated every single day. As one newspaper stated, it cleansed the city more faithfully than all our scavengers could have done the rest of the summer, referring, when he says scavengers, of course, to the pigs and goats that roamed the city eating garbage. We rejoice, he said, that our city is sweet and healthy. This editor, however, would regret these words. In the very next issue, the paper began to report that the standing water in people's cellars now produced a noxious effluvia, and that we have more to fear from this rain than from all the importations from the West Indies this season. Only a week after the storm, one resident remembered, quote, "The report of fever was from every quarter, like a besieged city set on fire with shells and red-hot shot." This writer estimated that more than 2,700 people died that fall. One of them would be Thomas Greenleaf, who wrote these words on the screen. So the person I just quoted, however, was a man named Grant Thorburn. And he's the only person, that is not the right order. There we go. He's the only person I'll talk about today for whom I have a portrait. Because late in life, he actually published his memoirs. Thorburn immigrated from Scotland as a 21-year-old nail maker about a year before New York's first major epidemic. And I want to describe the New York he found upon arrival. When his ship pulled into the harbor, this is a part of the city he saw. We see that the tallest buildings have only about 5 or 6 stories, and the vast majority are shorter than that. The city, in fact, is so low-slung in 1797 that the New Jersey hills in the background look almost like mountains. From this vantage point, the most distinctive buildings, in fact, are the churches. The spires tower above the warehouses and other buildings lining the river, and in the water are dozens of sailing ships. This is New York of the mid-1790s, the biggest city in the United States, one that still hadn't quite gotten to 60,000 residents. And as we can see in this map, although city leaders had begun to plot out new streets in what eventually became known as the Lower East Side, I have this thing up here. The inhabited part of the city stretched only a few streets beyond Chambers Street. So here's Chambers Street right here. Canal Street simply did not exist yet. And although many visitors commented on the grandeur of parts of Broadway, that wide, grand street where some of the wealthiest people lived, most of the city was cramped, grim, and noisy. One traveler wrote that the streets are small and crooked. The footpaths, where there are any, are narrow and interrupted by the stairs from the houses, which makes the walking on them extremely inconvenient. The houses are mean, small, and low. So when Grant Thorburn disembarked from one of these ships during July of 1794, he found a wharf alive with business, and he described being surrounded by dock workers loading and unloading cargo. Ferry boats coming downriver from farms in upstate New York were filled to the gunwales with ripe cherries. Ships from the Caribbean carried barrels of sugar and rum. Going in the other direction, ships bound for France and England were getting loaded with grain and flour. Walking along the wharves, Thorburn described hearing the sailors and dock workers singing as they unloaded the ships. Moving beyond the docks into the crowded, twisting streets of lower Manhattan, he would have found daily markets and street vendors with carts full of pineapples brought up from the Caribbean and sweet potatoes from South Carolina. Open-air meat markets sold everything from pork, beef, and wild turkey to possum, green turtle, and stingray. Thorburn found lodging in the attic of a house that likely looked like these, houses where, in many cases, each floor, including the cellar, was rented to a different person. Like many other streets in the city, Wall Street near City Hall, had a mix of 2- and 3-story homes, including old Dutch gable-ended houses. But like so many other streets near the docks on the East River, new emigres had begun to crowd in as their owners subdivided them and turned them into tenements or boarding houses. New Yorkers knew about yellow fever from Philadelphia's epidemic. So when new cases began to rack up during midsummer, many of them packed up their homes and left the city. Merchants moved to Bloomingdale, Harlem, and further afield. Thousands of wealthy and middle-class families moved in with relatives in the countryside in Long Island or New Jersey. In his memoir, Thorburn described the scene. Every vehicle, he said, from the humble dung cart to the gilded carriage, was now in requisition, removing families, furniture, and goods. The old man of 80, the lame, the halt, and the blind, all crowding the boats, the lanes, and outlets from the city. Hundreds of them died in the towns and villages around. So when the docks and the jobs dried up, some laboring men who lacked the funds to move their families out simply walked out of the city in search of paid work in agricultural areas nearby. Thorburn, though, got lucky. He had no money to leave, but his nail-making business thrived because the coffin makers needed him. One of them, he remembered, had, and this is a quote, had a light hand wagon with 4 wheels on which he placed the coffins and sent forth his 2 little boys to sell around the streets at $4 each. Stopping at the intersections of the streets, they would sing out, "Coffins, coffins of all sizes." But the most vivid passages from Thorburns' memoir capture his efforts to find help for his sick neighbors. He describes frantically seeking out doctors and nurses for the people he found suffering. And when some of those people died, he flagged down hearses to transport and bury the bodies. He was not alone. The poorest New Yorkers, those who, like Thorburn, couldn't escape the city and found themselves surrounded by illness and suffering, stepped in to care for their neighbors when they got sick or for their children when those children were left as orphans. When Catherine Kent died in late September of 1798, for example, she left behind an infant son. Her neighbor, Elizabeth Romaine, took the child in part because she had the ability to serve as a wet nurse for him. Others took in women whose husbands had died, deaths that left them penniless. A single woman named Catherine Sarney was one of dozens of single or widowed women who shared their apartments, in this case to a widow named Mrs. Descaux. And even with their combined resources, they still needed support from the city to have anything to eat. Another woman named Peggy Macklin told the city that she was nursing a sick man in her home, but that she had come to fear that her neighbors would attack her for bringing the disease so close to their homes. Hundreds of people like these stepped in to help on an ad hoc basis, while others worked more formally as nurses. These women's lives are the most difficult to reconstruct because they left no writings or memoirs recounting their experiences. And in fact, in many cases, we don't know whether they were literate. One of these, a woman I found in the medical archives here at Cornell, was a Black woman named Phyllis, who worked as a nurse at the New York hospital amidst a mixed-race staff that included 6 male and female nurses, a steward and a matron, an array of others that includes, but this is not exclusive, a cook, a baker, a gardener, 2 washerwomen, a porter, and a maid. Phyllis began working for the hospital at least several months before the 1798 yellow fever epidemic and was identified only by her first name, which was common at the time. Many Black New Yorkers, both enslaved and free, likewise only went by a first name. But Phyllis, we know, was a free woman and earned the same wages as her white colleagues on the staff. In July of 1798, only a month before the yellow fever epidemic broke out, she married a Black man named James Williams, who also wound up taking a job at the hospital in charge of those people they deemed incurable, that is, the insane and others with intellectual disabilities. The one time Phyllis signed for her wages, she signed with a mark rather than a signature, suggesting that she was likely illiterate or marginally literate. So for Phyllis Williams, working as a nurse at this point in history had significant challenges, even in normal years. Late 18th century people in the US and much of Europe took it for granted that when you got sick, you needed both a doctor and a nurse. But they viewed nursing not as any kind of professional labor, but rather as essential in the way that maybe you might consider someone working in the sewers as essential. And in fact, doctors often went out of their way to disparage nurses as ignorant and superstitious. But as many scholars have noted, those insulting comments about nurses did more to boost the doctor's own sense of themselves with their allegedly superior knowledge and training than to accurately describe nurses' skills in healing. More than anything, I think these disparaging comments remind us that women who worked as nurses often came from what some at the time would have called the lower sorts. Virtually everyone in their lives would have taken on the duties of nursing their families. But calling someone a nurse was usually reserved for Black and white women of lower social status because it involved the nastiest kinds of work. Duties that in other situations often got taken on by domestic servants, enslaved people, and poor women and their daughters. During ordinary months, Phyllis and her fellow nurses at the New York hospital cleaned bedpans, changed bedclothes, fed the sick, monitored the patient's illnesses, and tried to keep them from fretting. They administered medicines recommended by the doctors and sometimes cleaned dead bodies and laid them out for burial as well. During the yellow fever epidemics, the specific horrors of the disease meant that nurses had to clean sweat and blood, vomit, shit, and urine on a daily basis. When those patients suffered dangerously high fevers, nurses had to keep them calm when they hallucinated. Some of them may have received training in bloodletting as well, which was seen as one of the potential solutions to a particularly bad yellow fever case. So no one knew how to prevent or cure the disease, but they emphasized the importance of keeping rooms and bedclothes clean, a difficult task that required significant strength, because between heaving the buckets of hot and cold water, scrubbing the fabric and wringing it out, hanging it to dry, it's perhaps no surprise that one of the hospital's 2 washerwomen, as well as half the nursing staff, quit their jobs during the 1798 epidemic, leaving Phyllis and her peers to double up on their work until the hospital's directors could hire new employees. So in other words, nurses were vital. Remember, common wisdom had it that one needed both a doctor and a nurse, and yet they took on the hardest and least celebrated work and often found themselves demeaned by doctors. We can get at least a glimpse of the tensions of those hospital staffs in the diary of Alexander Anderson during the 1795 epidemic. Following the model established by the city of Philadelphia, New York rented an empty mansion house in the countryside several miles up the East River, an estate called Bellevue, to use as an isolation hospital for those people in the most desperate stages of the disease who had no one to care for them. The city hired the preposterously young Anderson, who was 20 years old at the time, to serve as resident physician. And it's his daily diary that really captures the stresses of that period. Bellevue at the time had 3 female nurses, 1 Black and 2 white. Within a week, one of the nurses had already succumbed to yellow fever, and a day after that, the staff began fighting amongst themselves. Being short-staffed, he told his diary, Anderson and some of the patients were obliged to nurse the sicker people. And this is a quote from the diary. I was obliged to fatigue and fret most unreasonably because the patients were suffering for want of nursing, he complained, frustrated that he had to do the work of a nurse because they were so short-staffed. The next day, he grumbled, I have thoughts of quitting my post. 50 years later, when he was looking back on his long life, he recalled that he witnessed above 100 deaths that fall at Bellevue and that it contributed to a terrible depression. That was 1795. During the far more devastating 1798 epidemic, while facing a citywide crisis, city leaders took an active role in recruiting nurses. These nurses received stunningly good pay, $1 a day, the same amount earned daily by low or unskilled laboring men. And now, to be sure, $1 a day maybe doesn't sound so generous as the ad has it, taking into account the risks that these nurses took. But considering that most women and African Americans ordinarily made only a fraction of a working man's pay, and the fact that equal pay for women and men was otherwise unheard of, you won't be surprised to learn that at least 114 people, mostly women, ultimately worked as nurses for the city, sometimes serving in one household after another for the thousands of poor families who asked for this kind of aid. Phyllis Williams worked throughout the epidemic. She and her husband James finally left the city in 1809 after more than 11 years as two of the most senior members of the hospital staff. I wish I knew more of what she might have to say about her experience, but I mean, we can only imagine the stories she might have told about working through the crisis. Nor did some of the other frontline workers leave behind their recollections of their experiences of doing the most dangerous work of, for example, carting the sick from their homes to the hospital or burying the dead. A Revolutionary War veteran, a Black man named Nicholas Sommerendijk, worked as a gravedigger, burying dozens of bodies at Potter's Field in what is now Washington Square Park. This was not an easy job. During a period when many experts believed that dead bodies were especially liable to spread yellow fever to healthy people, they insisted on wrapping those bodies in tar paper, which allegedly sealed in the dangerous fumes. Sommerendijk was lucky, as he never appears to have gotten sick. But Caleb Plum, another gravedigger, spent a week at Bellevue before finally recovering from a bad case of the disease. The last person I'm going to introduce you to is a man named James Hardy, a school teacher and another Scottish immigrant. Hardy had been too poor to move his family out of the city, so he spent the earliest weeks of the 1798 epidemic nursing two of his friends. When they recovered, he resolved to pay the same attention to my neighbors as I was willing to do to my friends. He said he wanted to perform the common duties of humanity rather than sitting useless in my own apartment. Nay, more, had I remained inactive, my mind might have become a prey to melancholy. I therefore determined to make no hesitation in visiting any sick person to whom I could be useful. He later explained that this gave him something to focus on during such a fearful time, because like most of his contemporaries, he believed that if he succumbed to fear, that fear itself could kill him. And so when the city's health committee heard that he wasn't afraid to visit the sick, they hired him for the duration of the epidemic as one of their inspectors. So New York City leaders created the health committee to deal with all aspects of the crisis. It was made up of doctors, aldermen, and other men who met daily and managed a huge array of issues. They closed the city to outsiders and they quarantined ships. They mobilized teams of doctors and nurses to care for people in the hospitals as well as in private homes. They published daily reports in the city's newspapers and warned people to stay out of the city. They hired a boatman to ferry patients from the inhabited part of the city up to Bellevue. And they took over the responsibilities of the city's almshouse for caring for the poor, many of whom had become increasingly desperate for lack of income, food, and firewood. The health committee hired inspectors like James Hardy to simply walk through the streets of the city, knocking on doors, speaking with people, and figuring out how to get them what they needed to survive. Inspectors walked around with carts full of food and wads of cash that they would hand out. And they kept careful records of the situations of the families they helped. These inspectors ultimately provided assistance to more than 2,400 individual households and recorded information about each, possibly because they believed that they would have to do an accounting and justify all of these donations in the end. So for us in the 21st century, Hardy's notes on his care for his fellow New Yorkers open up the doors of some of the most invisible households in the city and reveal snapshots of its inhabitants. So I'm just going to give you a few examples from his notes. Mrs. Baisley in Moore Street has lost her husband and 3 children with the prevailing fever. This is from Hardy's notes. She's now in great distress. Gave Thomas Duncan $2 for her use. Comfort Bishop of Chambers Street between Washington and Greenwich Streets states that her husband left her last winter and has not returned, that she has 3 children, that her eldest son, John Thurston, has been sick about a week, is getting better. Dr. Prince attends, gave her 1 chicken, and referred to Henry Hyde. Elizabeth Ackerman of Broadway, corner of Chambers Street, states that her husband went to sea last January and has not been heard of since. Has 1 child sick, are in want of necessaries, gave her $1 and 1 chicken. So many chickens. And finally, Hardy met several times with a woman he described as old, Elizabeth Commendinger, who told him that in ordinary times, she earned her meager living sitting in the Catherine Slip market for a living, selling coffee and hot chocolate to support herself and her husband, who could no longer work. During the earliest weeks of the epidemic, Hardy provided her with some food and money. But as time passed, the situation in her household got worse, especially with her children's families. Beset by death, by early October, all the survivors of her family had moved in with her and her husband. And here's what he wrote. Elizabeth Commendinger represents that the widow Sager, who died yesterday at number 54 Rutgers Street, was her daughter. That her said daughter left 3 children, 1 a sucking baby, which she, Elizabeth, has been obliged to take home. That Jacob Commendinger, her son, who died on Monday last, left a widow and 2 children, which she has also been obliged to take home. So this is a situation where a grandmother, eking out a living selling coffee at the public market, now adding 5 children and a daughter-in-law to her small apartment. It's no stretch of the imagination to recognize an impossible situation. Elizabeth's income would not be enough to support them going forward, which means that they would ultimately require public assistance from the city's almshouse, which could mean a lifetime of extreme poverty. So, what do all of these details about the lives of Phyllis Williams and her fellow nurses, the gravediggers and the hearse drivers, those like Grant Thorburn and James Hardy who delivered aid to their neighbors, the people like Elizabeth Commendinger visited by inspectors, what does this tell us about being on the front lines of New York's yellow fever epidemics? So I've dedicated all this time so far tonight to describing these people, their specific challenges, and the world they inhabited, because I think for many of us, this is utterly unfamiliar. But I also have 4 larger conclusions to draw. First, and to follow up on the story of Commendinger and her extended family huddling together in one small apartment, poverty soared as a result of the epidemics, both during and after. Because adult men were the most likely to die from yellow fever, losing a family's breadwinner could be devastating, given that women with small children likely couldn't work at all, and even if they could, they earned a fraction of men's pay. So unless those women married again, they and their families were likely to face grueling poverty for years going forward. This also placed enormous burdens on the city's overseers of the poor. The city funneled all of these resources into combating the disease, hiring doctors and nurses, and providing people with chickens and other supplies. But when the epidemics eased up in mid-November, when, as we know, the mosquitoes died off, the city faced an equally daunting epidemic of poverty. There's a much larger story to tell here about new efforts to reform public aid or to ask the poor to earn their assistance or to offer aid only to those poor people deemed deserving. But I'm only going to gesture to that here as one of the legacies of the epidemics of the 1790s. My second larger point in looking at people like Phyllis, James Hardy, Thorburn, and the gravediggers is to underscore the fact that immigrants and laboring New Yorkers did the lion's share of the work on the front lines of the epidemics. They cared for their neighbors, they took in one another's children, they hunted down doctors for the most desperate, and they cooked meals for the sick. doing the work in the midst of a disease that no one understood and that caused such terrifying symptoms demanded a determination to be of use and to risk one's own life and health to work for others. As I've mentioned, only a couple of the people I've discussed tonight left their own accounts of their experiences, but both Hardy and Thorburn specifically, although somewhat modestly, make reference to their sense that doing something for others helped them set aside their own anxieties and feel that they were being useful. I don't mean to downplay the work of doctors during this time. They also worked tirelessly, and many of them died, but they have received the most attention from other scholars. So focusing on this much less elite group of workers shows us, I think, an exponentially wider world of people on the front lines. My third point follows closely on this one. I want to underline that examining workers like these and the worlds they lived in unveils, I think, a deeply human story of the disease crises of this era. So in general, I think scholars have focused on horrific events with astoundingly high death rates, such as Philadelphia's 1793 yellow fever epidemic, again, when up to 12% of the population died, as if those death rates alone confirm the overall significance of the event. Just to use a more recent example, one of the aspects of the 2020 epidemic I found so exasperating back in March and April of 2020 was the way that we were inundated with numbers, graphs, infection rates, curves and spikes. Remember the curves? Remember the spikes? Don't get me wrong. I understand the need for numbers and graphs, but I'm a humanist. I wanted to understand what the pandemic would mean for people. And I found, especially in those early months, that those graphs often blunted the human story. So ultimately, I want this book to highlight people like these in order to track the effects and aftershocks of the yellow fever epidemics and give us a parallel story of what it's like to survive an epidemic. And I have one last larger point to make. This is a story about New York. It's not only a story about the city. Urban centers up and down the East Coast, from Portland, Maine to Charleston, South Carolina, had yellow fever epidemics during the same era. But the particular geographic landscape of the city and the unique demographics and dynamics of New York's development during this era made these epidemics unique in very distinctive ways. The specific responses by city leaders to yellow fever epidemics also had implications for the city's development going forward as it continued to grow exponentially. How could the city avoid those flooded streets and basements? How could so many new residents, find affordable housing? How could widowed women survive without a husband and a breadwinner? And how could the overseers of the poor wrangle with unprecedented new demands for help from the poor? How would this city, which was growing exponentially, address problems of water, sewage, and garbage? So in the end, I want to remain focused on people like these frontline workers because their stories, however unique, are echoed in today's New York City, in the experiences of people like you who continue to work on the front lines and wrestle with the social and cultural repercussions of COVID-19 or measles or whatever we have coming at us. Historians often like to say that history doesn't exactly repeat itself, but it rhymes. So I'm hoping that my book will reveal not just the lost world of 1790s New York City, but also the ways that that world resonates with our own. Thank you so much. I'm also very happy to take comments or questions about any of this material. And I know that some may be coming from online. Thank you so much for asking that. That has been something I've been focused on since the beginning. So yes, in 1793, there was a myth in Philadelphia that Black people were immune to yellow fever, which was not true and very quickly proven to be not true. However, it prompted an incredible outpouring of interest in people obtaining Black nurses during the yellow fever epidemics, which allowed some Black women allegedly to earn very respectable wages, which then produced a backlash by white people who were very upset about the fact that some of them had to pay $3 or $4 or $5 a day for Black nurses. That resulted in a very interesting dynamic of back and forth between Black leaders in Philadelphia and these sort of angry white editors and writers. I then obviously expected to see some kind of echo of that in New York City 2 years later in 1795 when the first epidemic hit. But by that time, the myth of Black immunity had more or less been debunked, and people had begun to acknowledge that that was not the case. And so what I have found so interesting and confounding is none of that racial backlash or anxiety about paying nurses too much money. I haven't found a single, I haven't found any of it directed against Black women or Black nurses. There was a little bit of anxiety about having to pay nurses, but what are you going to do? However, one of the things I also found confounding, just to follow up on that, and I'll keep this short, is that the New York City's 1798 epidemic more or less wrapped up in mid-November of 1798. In mid-December of 98, the state passed the Gradual Emancipation Law, which allowed for, starting in July of 1799, the Black children of enslaved mothers to be free. So every child born after July 4th of 1799 would be free. That's a complicated story, but I naturally assumed that maybe Black workers' work during the epidemics would have had something to do with passing that state law. And again, I have found no evidence that it did. In fact, in the number of emancipation papers of people individually freeing some of their enslaved people, I have also found no sort of gesture of thanks for the labor that they did during the epidemic. And so, New York City had a very complicated and fraught racial set of dynamics going on during this time. So I don't want to oversimplify and suggest that there is there's no tension. However, it's striking to me the things that I have not found the way that you do in Philadelphia. So thank you for that comment. Yeah, and that is a fascinating story. So the question is about the miasma theory, that somehow stagnant water produces this noxious effluvia that is possibly the cause of yellow fever. That was very much in play. And what it led to was a profound effort by New York City to deal with the issue of standing water, to the extent that, New York was a swampy, messy, watery place, and city leaders spent enormous sums literally raising the streets in Lower Manhattan. And every time the city spent the money to raise the streets, they insisted that homeowners raise their own lots so that there would be no standing water and a minimum of watery basements going forward. They also began worrying about the quality of the wells. The wells were getting poisoned by all the industry going on in New York City at the time. And so water remained a major issue in New York's history throughout. But yeah, that massive effort to raise the streets was all about dealing with standing water. Yeah, this is still a work in progress, right? So I have two solutions. As much as possible, I've been trying to collect the kinds of anecdotal evidence that I talked about here today. But with the help of Cornell's medical archives, I was also able to identify a lot of the people like Phyllis Williams who worked as nurses for long periods of time. And so with that, I'm able to at least construct the sort of outlines of their lives through tax records, through other kinds of fragmentary records in the city archives going downtown and so on. And so I'm a little bit hesitant to do this because I have never done this before, but there's a huge trend within historical writing about these kinds of non-elite people for whom we have no records to essentially use everything we know about people of that status and to engage in what they call critical fabulation. So to imagine the kinds of experiences that people like that would have had. And that's, in many of these cases, the only way we will be able to sort of get a glimpse into people's lives. You run a lot of risks in doing that. Historians have been a conventionally conservative group in terms of being willing to go down that alley of inventing people's experiences, but it is the only way that we can reconstruct people's lives, given the vast amount of research that we do know about the context of other, poor and enslaved people's experiences. Yes. Yes. Oh, should I be repeating the question, by the way? Yeah. So the question is whether I found letters from city or state governmental officials engaging with leaders in Philadelphia to sort of strategize about how to do it. And yes, very much so. In fact, not only was there a lot of correspondence back and forth, Philadelphia was also going through its own epidemic in each of these years, but they also, different cities donated funds and food and firewood to each other. And so there's enormous amounts of exchange going on during this time. And the doctors like Alexander Anderson and some of the nurses were trying to use some of the insights that people like Rush had come up with. I mean, Rush cured his own case of yellow fever, so he believed, using an extremely violent combination of poisons like mercury as well as bloodletting, really taking himself almost to the point of death. But he believed that had helped him. Other doctors were frantically writing back and forth to one another or to city officials about particular medicines, calomel and other kinds of medicines that they believed might be tried. People like Anderson were writing to friends. Elihu Hubbard Smith was another one, writing to friends and other medical experts, speculating that perhaps you might try, opium might be a solution. And so there was a lot of commentary about how to go about trying to cure the disease. I found that really interesting too. I have not seen, and I should say that is a line of thinking that I've been less interested in following. So I have been more interested in looking again at more non-elite people rather than at the kind of ways that certain ideas about disease etiology might sort of reflect different political factions. That has been less of a concern of mine. But I also haven't seen that appear in my sources as much. And it could simply be that I haven't looked in the right places. But it's a really interesting question. Great. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it.